An absolute juggernaut in the natural bodybuilding space, Brandon Kempter joins us for the first episode of the Strength Connect podcast.
Brandon is the founder of Big Hair Conditioning and a lifetime natural bodybuilder. He holds a master's in science, sports nutrition, and has competed himself since a teen, earning his pro card in 2016.
Since 2012, Brandon has been working in the fitness industry and in doing so has successfully coached natural athletes from amateur to pro international level. All right, well, welcome, Brandon. It's a pleasure to have you, mate. Now, I guess to start the podcast, we want to get a little bit more of an insight about you as a person and I guess where you grew up. Because for me and Aiden, I know Aiden's prepping with you, but for me, this is my first chance to get to know you and sort of delve into your story and your insights on social media and getting to know a bit more about you. So can you share us, and for the listeners as well, where it all
fantastic.
you growing up? How'd you get into bodybuilding?
Yeah, can do. So truthfully, I'm actually a bit of a country boy. Grew up in, well, a bit all over to be fair, but most of my life in North Queensland. Sort of beach meets ocean, like a beach town, etc. But really my bodybuilding, I suppose you could say journey, for lack of a better term, kicked off my mid-teens. Like most individuals, I grew up with comic books and I just loved the shape of these cartoon-like characters. And you know, in my mid-teens, my family had, well, they still have acreage, which is actually quite a long way from a gym. So my access to equipment was very limited, and you know, we had basically some Bessa bricks, concrete that went off, and you know, I remember ripping out a couple of pine trees, pulling them up with the tractor, and building a chin-up bar. Also had eventually a little bench press, and I built a self-spotting rig with two pine trees and a nice plank of timber with some ropes to the barbell, so I could pretty much rep out to failure and not die. And that's really where my training career started. Basic bare bones training, and at sort of 15 years of age or so. Thereafter, I had the opportunity to either study renewable energy, which I was really interested in after high school, or go into exercise science, etc. And as fate had it, the classes that I wanted to take were actually taken, they were essentially removed from the schedule for lack of interest. So I went to exercise science, and I'm very grateful for that. As fate had it, it worked out very well. And I started, obviously, like most, personal training, and I got on stage for the first time at 19 years old. And that was incredible experience. Very, I suppose you could say, organic experience, for lack of a better term, in that I just had this canvas that was my physique and a very pure interest in seeing how far I could take it. I remember rolling into the show with absolutely no idea who was showing up on the day, which was so lovely because there was no pressure. And very gratefully, I happened to win the teenage category, and that sort of set the tone for the next section of my career, sort of work through teenage, junior, open bodybuilding, professional bodybuilding. And more recently, my last season, I did exceptionally well in pro bodybuilding with the ICN World Champion crown, which is I'm very grateful for. But that's essentially my background there.
Tell you what, well equipped for COVID, with the setup there on the farm. I imagine you wouldn't have had any struggles when everyone went into lockdown in 2020.
Well, unfortunately, at that time, I wasn't living with my family, but when that happened, we all got really, really experimental. I'm sure you guys also. Yeah. But I mean, having that background experience, I suppose, allowed me to really get back to the fundamentals. And I mean, we're all principle-based coaches, and I'm sure we really leaned on those fundamental principles in that time when equipment availability was limited. Yeah.
Have you ever been back into the farm training since you left? Have you gone back to it briefly just to, revisit your roots?
Oh, I tell you what, I think my father has got rid of all these, we used to do shoulder presses with off bags of concrete, that kind of thing, a couple of tent poles, or, a tent pole and a Bessa brick either side for bicep curls, old school, So most of that doesn't exist anymore. And thankfully, I will say, having that background, just getting into a basic gym, I mean, gym standards these days are through the roof. It's insane what's available. But I mean, even getting to a basic gym, okay, we had a cable machine, a lat pull down, I mean, that to me was just, oh, this is amazing. I can do so much with this. So the level of gratitude I still have to this day being able to get into a regular gym is, yeah, it's phenomenal. So to answer your question, not really.
That's like the thing. You walk into a gym, I want the prime row or the Atlantis lateral raise machine, and then going back to the farm. It must create so much. You feel very fortunate about what you have, in these gyms now, and how well developed they are, and the equipment we have access to.
It's look, the prime equipment, the advanced equipment, etc. It's wonderful to have, and we should be very grateful to have access to that in a lot of very well equipped Australian gyms. The United States is just another level again. But truthfully, if you've got the fundamentals, which most of us didn't even have access to in COVID, you can go a long way. I mean, some of the best physiques. We look back at Arnold's time. What were they running on? Basic cable machines, leg press, dumbbells, barbells, good to go, right?
Yeah. I in high school when I first started training, my brother had a pair of adjustable dumbbells and then also had a bit of a dip set up. And I used to get my school bag, put some of my dad's bricks in there and just try and, get more bricks into the bag doing dips. And occasionally, I think in COVID, I went back to my parents' house and used that equipment again. And the
Yeah.
pump I got was actually unreal. Maybe it was just a bit of a novel stimulus, but it's
Yeah.
nice to go back to it.
Yeah. I mean, I did similar, two chairs doing dips with the backpack on. My old man would absolutely hate it when I'd bend his chairs. When I got to a certain point, I'm like, I've got 6 rocks in this bag, and and had my 75 kilo body weight going here. But yes, it is good to go back to the roots sometimes. Gives us a new level of appreciation, that's for sure.
I guess the next thing we want to talk about with you, Brandon, with the sport of bodybuilding, a lot of the time we find that people getting into this sport, generally it stems a lot of the time from whether it be like a sense of insecurity with the way you look or your size, or maybe innate interpersonal factors. What was the main, I guess, reason you pursued bodybuilding over, say, other team sports or other pursuits?
I think as a start, just to answer your question broadly before I get into it personally, I think a lot of individuals have this obviously precipitates pursuing sport. And sometimes it is due to external things like that. I want to, I don't know, get bigger biceps because I'm a teenager. I think women are going to love this. And that might get us started. But eventually what keeps us going is something more central if you're going to do it for, decade upon decade. I mean, for me personally, I always idolized to be honest, the swimmer's physique was my thing that I loved when I was a kid. Seeing these guys with like big delts, big lats, small arms. It's like a weird physique that I kind of really loved as a teenager. But I suppose my rationale for really getting into bodybuilding was, I suppose to some degree I wanted to improve my self-confidence. And that's where it might have started. And maybe it did in some ways. But for me, my relationship with bodybuilding is more than just lifting the weights and what it's done for me externally. It's the things it's done for me internally. I was a very impatient child. For example, what bodybuilding taught me is patience, thinking longitudinally, and my ability to change my physique, which is obviously so central to your being. That was, I suppose, proof to me that through strategy and work ethic, I could pursue other things like my academic, career, etc. So for me, bodybuilding is almost like a metaphor for life. And all the lessons I learned there, it just has all this transferability elsewhere. And I've sort of went off on a bit of a tangent there, but maybe to answer your
I think
question.
it's like that delayed gratification teaches you a lot of personal skills like patience and discipline. And a lot of these things, once you do a bodybuilding prep, in my belief, you hold over the course of your life, and you integrate that into other pursuits.
Yeah, and I think that really shows in the manner of which I coach. I believe truthfully, I mean, but there's a dark side to bodybuilding too. I mean, it can be immensely beneficial for an individual. It can also be quite damaging. But what I in my coaching love to do is share with others a sport that has, for me, just been so instrumental in my life. And I hope that passion really does shine through in the way I coach. Aiden, etc. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And, there definitely does seem to be a point where bodybuilding goes from being a healthy endeavor to a somewhat unhealthy endeavor in many cases. We see that,
Mm,
for example, with the abuse of PEDs, because the
yeah.
goal of so many is to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and they obviously help a lot. So, with that being said, at what point do you think it becomes unhealthy, and how have you tried to maintain that with your career and your goals as a bodybuilder?
Yeah. I suppose I'll start by saying, anything taken to an extreme has consequences. As we say, too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. In fact, anything from bodybuilding to maybe even uh, vitamin A, for example. This is a crucial vitamin. Have too much of it, you will die. So I think from a bodybuilding perspective, I would say this. If you're a drug-free bodybuilder, the majority of the daily tasks which you participate in are conducive to good health from the perspective, and by I should define health because obviously I'm not really referring to it as sort of the biopsychosocial model. I'm more referring to it from the perspective of optimizing body function. Because in the off season, right, we're training, hopefully in appropriate parameters. We should be focusing on nutrient sufficiency, both at the level of macro and micronutrients. Contest preparation, yeah, that's not overly healthy. The body is simply not designed to exist in an environment of low energy availability and to exist with such low volumes of body fat and a literal 20 plus times more lean mass. It's just not designed for it. So then the goal really becomes, okay, can we do it we want to do it in the healthiest way possible. And that obviously starts in the off season. And I suppose a component that ties into that is how frequently we compete, in which case I recommend that we compete essentially however long we diet for, we have 2 times the off season. That's a good ratio for progression and health retainment. And then obviously looking at the enhanced side of things, different kettle of fish there, noting that, a body that's outside of its homeostatic ranges in anything from endocrine function to body temperature, there is associated side effects. And with the limits of which those individuals are pushing pharmacology at the highest level, there is going to be associated side effects. And I don't work with those individuals, so I can't speak to that. But I mean, there is risk mitigation, or better said, attenuation strategies that those guys should be putting in place. It'd be short-sighted of them not to. And we've seen people who have literally died, particularly in the last few years. So yeah, I mean, in both scenarios, it's about doing it in the healthiest way possible. I suppose just to put it in a different context, motorcycle riding, that's a really dangerous sport. There are people that frequently die in motorcycle riding. But I mean, if you talk to a motorcycle enthusiast and you tell them you could die, you should probably stop riding. What are they going to say? Like, no way. I love this. This is my thing. Same with bodybuilding here. So what can we do to minimize the risk?
I've just got a piece of research here, Brandon. There was a study conducted in 2016, and this is in the Asian Journal of Sports Medicine.
Mm.
In this study, there's 234 bodybuilding athletes. So 51.7% of those were using PEDs. And the average number of agents that they were using was around 3.8, plus
Yeah.
4.52. So I guess that ranges from around three or four to around 9 different agents they were
Okay.
using. Now, the average number of years that they were using these agents for was around 4 years. And
Yeah.
so I guess we need to delve more into some of the literature. But what I'm taking from that is that people start with these agents, and then after 4 years, they're not using them anymore. So there's this large dropout potentially with people using PEDs.
Mm.
I imagine that would have a lot to do with some of those side effects that come with these drugs. I guess the expenses as well. There is this really grim reality associated with PEDs. If anyone approaches you for coaching or advice, what would be your key points or tips for individuals that are on that borderline considering, going
Yeah.
the IFBB route?
Look, I think, look, in general, that with the enhanced and non-enhanced side of things, I obviously have a bias for natural bodybuilding because I am a natural bodybuilder and it aligns with my values. But in general, I'm not necessarily anti-enhanced bodybuilder. I kind of look at it and I describe it like this on many occasions. It's like 2 different races. It's like go-kart racing and Formula One. I'm like, man, there's a different expectation of what's achievable, right? And there's a different level of risks. I can make the assumption that Formula One racing is probably more dangerous. We're carrying more speed here. So, and I'll also mention that as a natural athlete, natural coach, most individuals will know I work with natural athletes. I probably get less individuals that'll come to me asking for advice on the enhanced side of things. If I was an enhanced bodybuilder, I'm going to talk to someone who's walked that path. But I mean, the first thing I would say is, hey, you need to walk in with your eyes very open as to what's involved. And I don't believe that going the enhanced route should be something that you just decide willy-nilly, like, I want to give this a go. And don't get me wrong, I will say this, that and this might sound strange to say that, it should be a big deal. But I mean, living in Southeast Asia, gear is something you can bribe a pharmacist for. I mean, in Thailand, you wouldn't need to bribe them, but in Bali, you can order that off the web. I mean, sure, you can do that in Oz, but I mean, there's just, for those guys, it's a different culture. They start in the gym and it's like, oh, I just started taking this product. I'm like, mate, are you thinking? But in general, it should be something that is well thought out, and it should be thought out not in months, but in years and decades. Most individuals who start using enhancement, maybe not in this particular paper, but many will use it for life because they're going to shut down endogenous production to a level where it's unlikely to be revived, particularly if they're going for high level IFBB wins, because you're going to have to take very much super physiological doses of these products. So my best advice as a start is participate in drug-free bodybuilding. Get your feet wet here, right? At least live the lifestyle. Do this for a bunch of years. Decide whether this is something that I love, and then enough to do this for decades. And then also look at having the right people in your corner for risk mitigation. I am no expert on performance enhancing drugs, but I've seen people who have been chewed up and spat out on many occasions. And that's sad to me, because there are people that, I mean, I've seen it in natural bodybuilding too for other reasons, but there's individuals who might have a lot of potential. If they just don't have the right tutelage from the get-go, that's problematic.
There's been a bit of talk recently about the enhanced games. And James Magnuson has been a big proponent for that, I think, recently. And he said, I'll juice myself to the gills and I'll break the 50-meter world record. Now, I guess when you look on Instagram, TikTok, all forms of social media, YouTube, you can see to what extent bodybuilding has grown around the world. And I was listening to the Modern Wisdom podcast recently with Chris Williamson. He was talking about how big an issue, body dysmorphia is for males at the moment, a lot bigger than it is for women. How much do you think there is the chance that bodybuilding could become an Olympic sport, or, part of this potential enhanced games?
Well, I mean, a couple of pieces I'll just rewind a little bit. I mean, from the perspective of the culture globally in bodybuilding, things are definitely changing.
Yeah.
The everyday person has more exposure to bodybuilding in some way, shape, form, or capacity. And the younger generation going to the gym is pretty normal. And I mean, even just give you a random example, 10 years ago, the first time I went to Indonesia, I competed in a show. And I was in contest shape as a natural, albeit an okay natural, but the attention that I got was nuts. Everywhere I went, I was getting photographed. Whereas these days, the general population is more exposure to it. So, that sort of, it's not like a 1 in a million person to be in shape. There's a lot of people in good shape. But obviously, social media makes way for some interesting changes in perception, because being in really good shape, most people idolize at the level of, say, Olympia physique, that is almost like a default setting. Like that's how a real man looks. And it's like, well, that definition has changed a lot in recent times. And in reference to the enhanced games, I think it's actually a pretty fascinating concept. I mean, it's the equivalent of natural bodybuilding and then running like the IFBB, except we're opening it to other sports. In terms of the possibility that bodybuilding makes it there, I'd say it's probably unlikely, only because, one is the Olympia, and then two is the subjectivity of it. That's a challenging piece to contend with, and due to that, I think it would struggle to really gain traction on that. But I mean, I might be wrong. Who knows? And if the the enhanced games really takes off, then maybe the stigma surrounding enhancement is reduced. And maybe that's a good thing for bodybuilding. Maybe that's a bad thing for the health of the next generation because it comes normalized to use drugs. I'm not sure. That's an interesting piece.
Yeah, I think the stigma has definitely reduced around enhancement over the last 10 years anyway. Like I know when I was a teenager getting into bodybuilding, looking up to these people like on, YouTube and things like that, I didn't really have an idea of what was achievable naturally and what wasn't. And then it came out a few years later that all the guys I used to watch, they were all enhanced. And I remember first discovering that I was like, oh, okay. It seems like a normal thing, a lot normal, more normal than I thought, but none of these guys talked about it. Now these days it's very normalized to even, talk about the PDs they're using online and things like that, which I think is a good thing because it creates more transparency.
Yeah.
But then it also
It's-
gets, from what I can tell, a lot more people into it. Like working in a gym right now, I see many guys 18, 19, 20, like their first year into the gym, getting on gear, just like, it's a lot more widespread now, it seems anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I find this quite interesting. Our industry, in every way, shape, form, and capacity, will gravitate to extremes. You sit in this industry for 10 years, you're seeing the industry gravitate to one, then the other, then back again in terms of, well, everything from nutritional methodology to anything else. And in bodybuilding realm, I've seen where maybe when I started, performance enhancing drugs was more of a taboo subject. Uh, and for good reason. There is legality issues surrounding it. And you would have people who are at the level of IFBB say, oh, no, I don't do any of that. Anyone who's educated knows that, yes, it's comes with the territory at that kind of level. But I found at that point, in the natural game, naturals were pushing it to crazy levels for size. If we look back at sort of some of the greats, Justin Figueroa when he was at his prime. We're looking at Kiyoshi Moody, still going in his 50s. Mishak, like those guys, they were incredible. They were walking the line of what's possible as a natural athlete, and I truly believe they are natural. What I find interesting is when gear was more, or PEDs was more of a taboo subject, more people, I believe, actually believe that they were natural. Now that it's so talked about, and you've got these guys on YouTube and TikTok or whatever, who are 19 years old, really should not have touched any gear, but are running ridiculous products, talking to the masses with their big following, normalizing it. You're getting a lot of these young guys who look at someone like me, or God forbid, some of these other guys, which are, considerably larger again. They go, oh, that's completely not possible. And I think that's damaging because, I mean, yes, enhancement works, but it's just really underestimated what actually can be done naturally. And I think even more so now because people have removed the moral kind of barrier to entry for enhancement. It's changing culture.
Yeah, 100%. I think if you go on Instagram and just find average, beach ready type physique, in the comments, they'll be like, not natty, not natty, not natty if they claim natural. It's like, I 100% agree with that. But I also think there seems to be, from what I can tell, a growing popularity with natural bodybuilding and staying natural. From what I can tell anyway, just in what I'm seeing. So where do you think natural bodybuilding is going at the moment?
Look, I think no matter what happens, there'll always be a place for natural bodybuilding. Natural bodybuilding, let's just say physique sports as a whole, there's been an evolution, and there will continue to be. For example, when I started, there was bodybuilding and that's it. We were doing a teenage category with 27 athletes on stage, 25-minute categories, 3 rows. It was just insane. And then since then, we had men's physique come in, IFBB first, the other federations later. That was the in piece. Then we have classic physique in the last, 6 or so years. That's come in. So it's changed, and it's the physique sports as a whole. But I think natural bodybuilding, there's always going to be a place for it. But it's just in general more spread out. But I hope it retains. I mean, I hope we can continue to positively contribute to it and see it grow. I mean, my ultimate piece here, like from a coaching perspective, when I'm busted up, no longer coaching, etc., my hope is that, I've left the industry, we have left the industry better than we left it, and brought the next generation of true bodybuilders and hopefully drug-free bodybuilders and coaches into the game to sort of hold pass on the baton, so to speak. So I hope we continue to rock and roll.
I know we've already noted that you're firmly entrenched in the natural bodybuilding scene and less so associated with, say, the IFBB and those enhanced shows.
Mhm.
Based on that point we just talked about, where natural bodybuilding has got a increasing popularity, imagine in Australia here,
Mhm.
each year we only have, one IFBB professional in each category per year,
Yeah.
national show. So how
Mm.
much do you think that, I guess, participation in the IFBB in Australia is contributing to that increasing popularity of natural bodybuilding, considering, I guess, you get that kind of bottlenecking effect where there's all these people taking gear, but there's only, one pro being produced in each category per year. And, what opportunities is there? Do you have to move to the States to become a pro?
I mean, look, I suppose I have some mixed, like, random thoughts on this from a couple sort of perspectives. Uh, as a start, I will say that within the natural side of things, there is a lot of pro cards being handed out now. Some might say it's good, some might say it's bad. When I started natural bodybuilding, there was only one way to get an INBA pro card. They were the only natural federation. Oh, we had the A and B as well. There were the only two federations, but you were going to the United States for one of two shows to get a pro card. So, I remember at 19 years old, setting out a 7-year timeline. I said, man, I'd love to get a pro card before I'm 27. That's a level of planning which I don't think many young individuals these days understand. Like, man, there is 2 pro cards per year, I think 3 actually at a time, available in the United States. That's where I'm going. It was the aspiration. Now, obviously, there's been a million and one branch offs in drug-free bodybuilding Australia, all offering their own pro card and usually many pro cards. So pro card to me, I mean, I've won a pro card, lost it, won it again. It doesn't mean too much. So I would say the IFBB, that what they have done in creating scarcity is somewhat attractive in a way.
Yeah.
It could be seen as attractive. And the IFBB, given their link with the Olympia, it is the Formula One. So it is what I would define as the Formula One of bodybuilding. So I mean, some might see that scarcity as a good piece. So some maybe not. I'm not sure. But I mean, again, with drug-free bodybuilding, it's I think it'll always have its place. As to how much the IFBB contributes to it, I don't know. There's a lot of social pieces that sort of come into play there. Yeah, so I don't know if I can answer that.
I guess, with your large client base, a lot of them are in the States. You've got some clients in Korea,
Yeah. Yeah.
domestic clients like Aiden here. How do you, I guess, manage time zones? Like, to be an athlete yourself, sleeping and managing that kind of thing, your body clock, with all these different clients in different time zones competing, it must, and by season as well, A season, B season, I imagine
Mm.
at different points throughout the year when you're trying to prep yourself, it can be a real hard task to juggle that.
And you're
It
also
definitely
traveling
can.
internationally as well. Oh, sorry. You're also traveling internationally as well, I've noticed, for shows and things, conferences and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, look, it definitely can be tough. And I suppose on the most behalf, I look at myself as 50% athlete, 50% coach on the most behalf. But there are times where maybe it's skewed 70-30. For example, coming into a season B, which is always generally the biggest season. And last season was a good sort of example where, each weekend which is pretty standard these days, for I think 11 weeks we had a show. Sometimes there was two or so shows on the same weekend between Australia and the US, etc. The US time zone difference between, say, Queensland and California is 13 hours behind. So that definitely is pretty tough. So I mean, number one piece is we don't work with the same, myself and Daniel, so our senior exercise nutrition scientist. I mean, as a start, we don't work with the sort of volume that a lot of individuals do, to be fair. I know a lot of guys running Gen Pop guys who the volume they tell me they work with, I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, you couldn't do it with Connors Prep. Well, maybe you could with Connors Prep if you were running a more diluted service. Given that we work primarily with bodybuilding and those sort of categories which require a higher degree of muscularity and conditioning. Everything's to the wire. It takes time. Coaching is hands-on. So we tend to moderate our athlete load as a start. And we do two things. We moderate the athlete load and we moderate the per season load. Because when you come into a season, your workload is going to triple when you're putting in place peaking structures, you're evaluating more frequently, and you're working with show days on different time zones. So in those scenarios there, we cap that load as well. We do have some systems in place, but I mean systems, I mean it's the base, but when you're working at the level which we need to, everything's so individualized. It is just a time costly piece. But that's probably our biggest piece here is managing our client load and forecasting the workload that's coming into a season. They're our primary pieces.
How about nutrition, like meal plans and things like that for clients in different countries? Because the food availability is obviously different.
Yeah. So I will say in the United States, anything we have, they have better, particularly when it comes to diet-related products. But when we are working with individuals in, say, Asia, for example, yeah, there's some big differences in their sort of cultural norms in reference to food availability. So something like, for example, oats. It's a staple piece in Europe, Western countries. You go to Southeast Asia and it's either not available or you'll be paying a lot more than you would in Australia. I mean, even barley, for example, I mean, oats is usually imported from the United States, but in Korea, it's just like, wow, it's super expensive. I suppose another example would be something like 5% lean mince. You don't get that in Southeast Asia. Mince is for the crap parts of the animal that we want to throw together. So there's definitely some learning there. And I think and to be fair, I'm constantly learning, a student for life. But I suppose as part of that, I believe that every good coach needs to listen. Listen makes way for empathy. Empathy makes way for personalization. So when we do our consultations with individuals in different countries, we go, okay, what do you have available? And also, I suppose, what is your nutritional literacy? Are they in a position where they can draft a plan and we can proof it? So I suppose coaching is very personalized, but yeah, there's definitely some challenges there. Definitely.
You know, like a bit of a personal anecdote. 2017 takes me back to the A&B universe in Manila, and this was my kind of first experience traveling internationally for a bodybuilding show, and
The
it really
Philippines of
was like that, a bit of a baptism of fire. And I'd love to get maybe some of your insights where you've gone overseas for a show and you've had to navigate your decision making on the go with food and that kind of thing. Because when I went to Manila, we touched down and I had to go to the local grocery store just down the road, get some sweet potato and chicken. And they had all the sweet potato was purple. And with the Philippines, a lot of their food's very high GI. So like purple sweet potato, watermelons, jasmine rice. And then I went to the lady and I said, can I get some chicken breast? And I basically had to buy everything that was there. There was so limited amount, and I cooked it up in the room with minimal supplies. It was such a good, little learning experience or cultural experience. Yeah. But do you have any stories, similar things like that, where you've had to learn on the go? And how has that taught you? What has that taught you about working with clients abroad as well and what they have available?
Yeah, I mean, look, the first time I went to Bali was for a show. And I'd never been to Bali. And to be fair, it's definitely developed a lot since then, at least within these sort of expat tourist hubs, if you will. But I mean, I flew in 3 days or 2 days before that show. And I actually, on that occasion, brought all my food with me, essentially. So I remember packing a whole lot of tin tuna. That was my primary protein source for that section there. It was just a matter of, okay, what vegetables can I get there? And obviously, bok choy, pak choy, these sort of more Asian vegetables is what I use. And I cooked everything in a microwave. You can do a lot with the microwave, man. So I kind of made that work on that occasion. But even traveling to the United States, I mean, we did 3 weeks and 3 shows over there, and I cooked everything in a microwave. But in the United States, to be fair, food availability is in good stead. The big thing with traveling to the United States is the travel time and the time difference. And this is where, okay, when you're taking things on an airplane, there's little things like, okay, to most countries, United States included, liquids need to be under 100 milliliters. So you're taking small tins of tuna. Cooked vegetables is usually fine. Raw is not so. So we might kick the fruit to the side. Fruit more than anything is coming into Australia. We have crazy border control. And, frozen packs, warm it up on the plane, sweet talk the stewardess there, and you should be fine to go. But the time difference is definitely hard to work with when traveling. But we really exercise with our athletes a high degree of organization, and try and personalize it based on where they're going. The Philippines, yeah, I'm sure. I have actually not been to the Philippines, but even in Indonesia, if you know where to go, then you can get the right stuff. But otherwise, if you go to a market and you ask for chicken, there's no chicken breast. It's the whole chicken. They don't waste anything. So yeah.
I have found in, my own online coaching that one of the challenges I had to first overcome was teaching intensity. And especially when you have someone who isn't already a high level bodybuilder, and you're teaching them about adequate intensity, how to push beyond what they think they're capable of. And with you, you're primarily online and you're working with people where the intensity, especially in a prep, is essential. It's super important in maintaining, muscle mass. So how do you go about that? And is that something you struggle with at first or found was a bit challenging?
I suppose a couple of things to consider here is, I generally tend to work with individuals of whom have trained for a few years. My general individual would be I've trained for a few years, done a show, and I want to take it to the next level. Mind you, I do work with obviously a lot of first timers, but even within the first timers that I work with, most of them probably followed along for a year or two. They have an idea of kind of what I'm about and a good level of base experience. Now that's handy. Doesn't mean I can't contribute to their learning further, and that intensity, I believe intensity is something that it's an experiential process. Train this hard and what's easy, train this hard and what's easy. So you're constantly learning, but it probably makes it easier for me versus another individual of whom has less experience on the on. But then we do use video analysis quite frequently. And I often refer to some of the subjective indicators of movement quality and training intensity. And I'm sure, the fundamentals here, we're talking tension awareness, metabolite production, cell swelling, immediate performance reduction, post-set, and other indicators of intramuscular perturbation. But in general, I do think there is benefit to having a session with someone of whom you respect, even just one session as a means of benchmarking intensity. That's you've got that as a mental reference for years to come. But yeah, it can be a challenging piece. Definitely can. Video analysis is probably the most practical tool we have at our disposal for sure.
When you're setting that benchmark for training intensity, what techniques have you used if someone hasn't had that experience with another individual to show them? Do you use do you get them to do like a 10 rep max, a 1 rep max to set a benchmark training intensity for their training protocol? Do you use RPE, rate of perceived exertion measures, and give them a scale? Reps in reserve. How do you teach them about those kind of principles and applying them, as we said, when you're completely online?
Yeah, look, it can be challenging. Look, if I have someone in person, I'm actually going to take them through a set of leg press. I believe leg press is a benchmark for intensity. When you think that's a ceiling, you probably go a little bit more in the tank. And if you can train a set to failure on a leg press, I dare say you can take a quote unquote leg press mentality to a less systemically taxing movement, and you will rock and you will roll. If I have someone in person and they're an experienced athlete, not a novice, well, let's say they're an intermediate athlete, right? They've got a bit of training under their belt, but maybe they haven't experienced the top end. I will often take them beyond failure for a couple of sets. It's a matter of, okay, here is the ceiling. Here's what it feels like to go beyond it. Now recalibrate to where true failure is. I do believe you require a couple of things here. You require a lot of, you need exposure to where your ceiling is to be able to judge reps from reserve and failure, because that's a skill. I also believe going to true concentric failures in and of itself a skill, because there are in fact a few different types of failure. 3 primary types of failure would be technical failure. One of the reasons I like a leg press for testing intensity ceiling, because there's less buy-in for skill. The other is preset failure or psychological failure. That's again something you work on through repeated exposure. And then obviously we have momentary failure, concentric failure. Obviously your goal is to be able to delineate what is technical failure, what is preset failure, in pursuit of being able to work in close enough concentric failure. It's one of those things where, like, do we have to train to complete momentary or momentary slash concentric failure
So
every set?
that would be lower limb, Brandon, like doing a leg press, say. What would be a good example you'd provide for the listeners for, say, like an upper limb strength assessment, say for like a pull or a push? Because obviously with like a row, for instance, there's a lot of chance that you'd be swinging or using other lower, like erector spinae
Yeah,
to perform the movement.
definitely. I mean, look, push-based movements, a machine is going to be a great means of evaluating that. Pull-based movements, things get complicated. It's complicated because you're dealing with a series of joints, scapulothoracic joint, all of your thoracic vertebrae. There's literally 40 joints that contribute to glenohumeral movement. And that makes it inherently very challenging to go to true failure. And obviously, we're going to be setting a base in terms of a high degree of movement quality, but a chest supported pull based movement would probably be a go-to piece in sort of benchmarking intensity. But I do think in general, we use a few movement selections. Again, we could personalize coaching, meet the athlete where they're at. But we might use a few movement selections to benchmark intensity. But I do believe that going to or close to concentric failure is something you need to almost learn on a movement by movement basis, because different movements recruit different tissues. The muscle architecture determines the force curve or strength curve that they can provide. And then you're obviously working with different movements that have a different range and a different force curve within as well. So it feels very different to go to failure on a chest supported row versus a vertical pull. So, it's I suppose a gradual piece in the sort of evolution of the individual working with in teaching them. But I mean, practically speaking, those few movements would be my go-to sort of starting piece, if that makes sense.
On the topic of training to failure, it's something we wanted to explore a little bit because just to zoom out, part of our purpose on this podcast is really to try and reconcile evidence-based training or what that kind
Yeah.
of means, because it's really been bastardized a little bit online.
Yeah.
Over the last couple of years, everyone claims to be evidence-based with, no real education or not much education. And you have people kind of like the old school bodybuilders who are very much like almost anti evidence-based now because of that. And there's a bit of a shift here.
Swing to extremes, always.
Yeah, exactly. So on the topic of reps and reserve, a lot of the papers coming out now, they're suggesting that training 1 to 2 reps away from failure would offer similar hypertrophy gains to failure with less fatigue. So some would suggest that might be a more sustainable way of training, but I personally am not, I don't know how I feel about this, because bodybuilders all throughout time, the most successful ones were always training to failure and beyond failure. So how do you reconcile this research and how do you implement it into your training with yourself and clientele?
I will say as a start, I appreciate, respect, and understand the concept of purposely leaving reps in reserve. I mean, the concept here is that, we're going to accumulate fatigue in both the peripheral and central fraction. Peripheral fatigue is often associated with peripheral stimulus. Good. Central fatigue limits peripheral fatigue / stimulus accrual. Not so good. So what can we do to limit central fatigue so we can accumulate more net peripheral stimulus? And the theory states that, okay, we need to train in close proximity to failure to facilitate the accrual of hypertrophy stimulus. And there appears to be a diminished, possibly at least, a diminished return in terms of peripheral stimulus when we go from, say, 3 reps or 2 reps from reserve to 0. But there's a disproportionate increase in central fatigue due to the big cardiometabolic response. So why not pull back a little bit? Maybe we get more out. And I think that might be a sound thing. Maybe. Okay, but there's probably a couple of problems here. One is when you start to, we've seen this, okay, where individuals taking this at face value is that training to failure is not good. And I'm gonna say, well, if you haven't had exposure to failure, you can't judge proximity to failure. And therefore, I believe we had a big lull there where individuals, I mean, I'm speaking broadly here, but those in the evidence-based realm, or more than anything, those of whom claimed evidence-based that didn't have a background in scientific, a formal background in science, end up training with not enough intensity. And that's problematic, right? So I get, this has its place. But yes, and on the other hand, if we look at in anecdote, which is poor form of evidence, but the best bodybuilders in the world were all about trying to find ways to train harder, not easier. So there's a bit of a midway here. And I suppose from a practical perspective, I acknowledge that training harder always is not always the answer. But I believe that most individuals, this is a belief system here, because we look at Martin Raffaello's work, he would indicate that most people are really good at evaluating proximity to failure. I love Martin's work. It's a bit conflicting with other research, but at least in that sample, they're really good at judging proximity to failure. In my experience, people are not overly great at judging proximity to failure. And the way I like to use reps in reserve is, instead of using it as a means of pulling back, I would use it as a means of auditing intensity. Did I have another repetition if I'm in a hard section of training, I did. Okay, there's a little bit more I can wring out for next time. So I don't know if I answered your question then, if I didn't, fill me in.
Yeah. And Martin, on the topic of Martin Refalo, he had a study in 2024 that did look at the differences in hypertrophy between 1 to 2 and failure. And his study and a lot of other studies, I think one of the limitations is that they're over like 8 weeks. And we know that hypertrophy is a slow process. So, and it is hard to really accurately assess hypertrophy of like 6 months. So could that be playing into it? If we were able to look at hypertrophy over 12 months, 1 to 2 reps in reserve versus failure, maybe we'd see more of a difference in hypertrophy there.
It's plausible. I mean, realistically, any paper has methodological limitations. Unfortunately, in everything that we look at in sports science, the samples are tiny. So my wife, fiance rather, who does research in the medical field, I mean, she looks at some of the research like, what? You got 40 participants. I'm like, honey, this is fantastic. She's like, we wouldn't do anything less than like several hundred. We need more statistical power to really pull out something decent. And like, yeah, most of the studies that we look at are really underpowered. And yes, there's limitations with duration as well. And if you've conducted research, you'll know how bloody hard it is to get participants, A, and B, when you're looking at lab-based, or at least studies that require the level of supervision, when you're looking at RPE, and obviously you need a lab to evaluate these outcome measures, it is damn expensive. So it's huge burden on the research, on the participant. So yes, there's major methodological limitations there. I know Dr. Zach also did some research, also collaborated with Martin as well. His paper tends to indicate that there might be positive benefit with training in closer proximity to failure, but he's the first to put forth the potential limitations in his methods as well. So right now, I suppose we're in this mid ground where, we can draw, I suppose, both directions from the research to a degree. But I believe when it comes to being evidence-based, right, you got to get back to the fundamental definition of evidence-based. It's essentially 3 components merging together: best research, a logical understanding, so mechanisms, and then looking at the person in front of you. And you may have an individual of whom is able to train very frequently to failure, possibly beyond it. I've worked with some individuals that frequently train beyond failure, force negatives of 3 on every single set. And it's like, man, I'm breaking with that. But if they respond incredibly well to it, they're well acclimated to it, because you will acclimate to your training intensity to a degree. And managing recovery, I would say, fantastic. This might be an appropriate recommendation for that individual. There might be other individuals where it's not suitable. So, we have to personalize there. But it's an interesting spot that we're in right now on that side of things.
Doubling down on that concept of recovery when it comes to training intensities and hypertrophy, in that paper that Aidan just alluded to, Refalo 2024, which is a very recent paper, they found in that particular study that there was greater neuromuscular fatigue with the group that trained to failure. So I guess when you consider that, would you say that, training with 1 to 2 reps in reserve and training to failure, one of the major overarching differences, just to simplify things for the listeners, would be related to the ability to accrue volume of training over time due to that, I guess, central fatigue that you would develop?
Yeah, I mean this is the sort of argument is that there comes a point where there's a diminished return on stimulus accrual at the tissues you want, at the peripheral tissues, and a disproportionate increase in central fatigue. So that's the argument for holding back a little bit.
Yeah.
And like I said, I sort of am somewhat in the middle here. I will say this: I have personal biases, as does anyone. I have a bias towards intensity. I want to say that from the get-go. It's important to acknowledge this. I have a bias towards intensity, primarily as a product of the era that I came up in and the mentors that I had. Mentors that I had certainly pushed intensity. And through my process of bodybuilding, I have learned to train harder. And I've always endeavored to learn how to train harder because there is just so many levels to that. And I do acknowledge the rationale behind pulling back on occasion. And I believe this, just because, I believe that intensity is one lever. There are times where you want to pull back, okay? But there's also times where it's very appropriate to hit the intensity lever and go. Where things get a bit opaque is with the interpretation that we should never train a failure. And that's something that I have a problem with, where I'd say, hey, the actual research doesn't say this. This is a matter of interpretation from someone of whom is unscientific with their thinking and taking research at face value. So I didn't really answer your question, but yes.
when you say pull that lever back, and you got to switch into different gears.
Yeah.
A lot of what we spoke about there is, they're very much the science-based side of things. But if we take a step away from the science and we think about things more practically, this is something that Aiden and I have discussed a fair bit in the last couple of weeks. But
yeah,
for me personally, I really struggle with deloading because reducing the intensity to say 50 to 60% of my maximal intensity.
Yeah.
Me, I'd prefer just to have a week off and just do my cardio and rest up and then come back and start the next week in my block. Because me going into the gym and training half-hearted isn't as appealing to me. So to what extent is this, I guess, training to failure and reps in reserve less of a question about hypertrophy and recovery and more of a question about, training mentality?
So I suppose the first thing to keep in mind is that our experiences shape our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. And you're coming at this from a perspective of someone of whom is a high achiever. I want to work hard. I want to leave no stone unturned. I want to go to sleep at night knowing it's impossibility that anyone else outwork me. I want to get to stage knowing that everything was cross T's, dot the I's. In such a scenario there is an appropriate time to pull back a little bit. It's knowing, as I often say, we teach amateur athletes how to train hard. We teach advanced athletes when to train hard. Go now, pull back now. That goes for nutrition and training. So, if it's important, I suppose, to acknowledge that in such a scenario here, there might be, you might want to pull back a little bit, but there are also other individuals who don't share that high achieving mentality. In such scenarios, they may interpret that said research through an unscientific lens and say, okay, I should never train to failure. And that's going to bottleneck their progression a lot. So it's a challenging piece to kind of answer there, but I suppose an important lens to view things through.
I'm interested in your personal opinion or philosophy around deloads in general, because I know with me, we've been training now, or I've been training under you for I think 6 or 7 weeks of prep plus a month outside of that. And I train to failure every session. And I've had times when I've been pretty beat up or feeling beat up. And it seems like, from what I can tell, your mentality is like, let's do everything we can to avoid not being in the gym and having time. And I like that, to be honest. Like, I like pushing myself, finding where my limit is. So how do you conceptualize deloads and when do you use them for your clients?
Yeah. So deloads are actually a fascinating piece because I did actually participate in one of Dr. Pack's studies a while back on the topic of deloads. So I mean, generally, I would define a deload as follows: essentially a strategic decrease in training intensity and/or volume with a specific function of mitigating accumulated fatigue. And there's obviously a few ways to implement them. You could have a static deload, right? Just take time out of the gym, as you were saying. Alternatively, you could reduce your intensity and or volume. When it comes to how I apply it, generally speaking, I'm going to go for a volume reduction, keeping intensity in place in a contest preparation, because in a contest preparation, we need the training stimulus to essentially to send a strong signal to promote the preferential liberation of energy from adipose tissue and the retainment of muscle mass. So I don't necessarily want to decrease intensity and volume or just take 1 week out of the gym and stay in a deficit. If I'm going to do something like that, I'm probably going to go back to maintenance to reduce the sort of the catabolic load systemically. Therefore, if we have a recovery problem, I'm usually going to opt for reducing training volume, keeping the intensity. Or if we're going to reduce the intensity, it's going to be a marginal reduction. Let's leave a rep in reserve, which is not the general kind of recommendation there. But it's really on an as-needed basis. I do believe when it comes to the human body, again, appealing to my biases here, that a lot of individuals really underestimate just how resilient the human body is. Okay, the human body is, I mean, for example, if you have liver, if you've destroyed your liver from alcoholism, you didn't have 10 drinks on a Saturday, you've done this for years, probably decades. The body is very, very, very resilient. And if we look at bodybuilding versus another sport, I mean, I love working with athletes from, say, swimming, for example, or ultra endurance athletes that take a stab at bodybuilding. These guys are like, yeah, I train 6 days a week, 2 days in the pool. My smallest day is a Sunday, it's 2 hours in the pool. And I look at bodybuilding, I'm like, yeah, you want to train weights for 2 hours a day? Most of that's resting. It's like 5 minutes of actual lifting a day. Trust me, the body can take this quite well. But I'm not saying that recovery shouldn't be a consideration. Absolutely should be. It's just that, like anything, you could overcapitalize on it to the point where you're cutting yourself short in your result. And I also acknowledge that there are certain times when you are in hard training phases where you're going to feel a little bit beat up. I mean, yes, sometimes it's appropriate time to push through that, and there's appropriate time to pull back. So there might be short periods where you're like, I'm feeling pretty beat up. Okay, can we push through this for a little bit? If we need to, then it's time to implement I suppose you call it a devolume, if you will, right? But it's definitely on an as needed basis, especially in a contest prep. One other thing I put forward is that sometimes in a contest preparation, despite the fact that your recovery ceiling is lower, for some individuals, it appears they're quite resilient in the dieting condition when it comes to training related fatigue, because it's possible their training is not as progressive in nature. Therefore, they're accumulating less fatigue per unit of training volume. So another point to kind of ponder as well.
When we look at different types of athletes down the more enhanced side of things, we can definitely apply this to some natural athlete examples. But, you say you look at someone like Jay Cutler. Everyone knows Jay Cutler, Olympian, who I guess dethroned Ronnie. Now his style of training compared to someone like Mike Mensah, or we talked about Dorian Yates, very low volume, very high intensity to failure. Is there like, I guess, differences between the individual and how they respond? Is that something that you work a lot with your clients about, finding out how the individuals respond to different loads? Because if you're talking there about someone who's a marathon runner coming into a bodybuilding comp and they have this insane insulin sensitivity from all their running and their mitochondrial density, but can they handle greater loads, and is that how they're going to respond better? I'm not sure.
I mean, maybe
take on that.
Maybe not initially, obviously in the transition. But I will say this, there is a couple things. Obviously, you're talking at two end of the extremes here. Everyone loves extremes. The first thing I'd say is that guys like Mike and guys like Dorian Yates, they are proponents of low volume training, but their training's probably not as low volume as you think, because they were known to do a few warm-up sets, which were pretty bloody hard, probably within 3 reps short of failure, and then one all-out set, or maybe two. So I believe that the amount of productive or effective volume, i.e. reps in proximity to failure they accumulate, is probably more than most people assume. So start with that. But then in the second component, yes, there's definitely interpersonal variability, substantial. In fact, there is research indicating essentially that in individuals who are hyper responders, they don't tend to require much volume to grow. They tend to accumulate a lot more fatigue per unit of volume. Hence, they don't need as much volume on a per set basis to grow, and they can't handle large volumes. In opposition to that, those of whom are considered hard gainers, there's many regulatory factors centrally and peripherally that may influence this. Those individuals seem to accumulate less stimulus on a per set basis, hence require more set and are more fatigue resistant. Many things probably come down, influence this, but let's just think logically. If we have an individual whom is more hereditarily biased towards type 1 fibers, these are probably the quote unquote hard gainers. They have high fatigability and they have a lesser, there's less potential hypertrophy adaptation by virtue of the fiber type. And obviously, yes, it's hypothesized that this is somewhat influenced through hypertrophy, through training adaptation, fiber composition, but there's definitely hereditary basis. So yeah, in summary, there's definitely individuals who don't need much volume, probably can't manage much volume. These are your hyper responders, and there's those who are on the opposite side of there. And obviously, there's other things that come into play, like movement selections, training intensities, microcycle design, etc. But yeah, a lot of variability.
Yeah, and I sort of think when you look at that, you've got your fast twitch fibers, or your type 2, and then your slow twitch muscle fibers, type 1. There is a large proportion of those. You look at a lot of the research, and those that are Black or African American, there is this hereditary factor where they have a lot more of those fast twitch or type 2 fibers. When you have someone come to you, so you said you've had some swimmers come to you, or some endurance athletes, is it like this phase where you're trying to transition them into more strength, lower rep training to try and get a larger quantity of type 2 fibers due to their ability to grow in terms of muscle size? And
yeah, I mean, look, if you're taking them from that sport, completely different sport, right? And by virtue of their training, they've accumulated a lot of adaptation just in a different portion, essentially a different compartment, right? They've got really good mitochondrial density, not much hypertrophy. I mean, realistically, if we have this athlete participate in a gradual transition, right? Because they need repeated exposure to accumulate the adaptation required to really start pushing in meaningful amounts of volume. You're going to accumulate whatever adaptation in terms of fiber shift you can by virtue of that, right? So, I mean, I wouldn't sit here and go, I have a specific program that's going to make you fast twitch dominant. It's like the resistance-based training is going to do that. Let's go. I will say, off topic, but one thing that I love about working with athletes like that, whether it be swimmers, ultra or marathon runners, or even ex-military, is that the mental toughness they develop is incredible and has wonderful transferability to bodybuilding. It's a unique type of hard, but I still don't think bodybuilding is as hard as some other sports. I mean, personally, I would take on a contest preparation any day than participate in a prep for a ultra marathon or an iron distance triathlon. I'm like, no way. that to me is much more mentally challenging, I'd assume, at least.
I'm quite into football or soccer, and I follow the EPL, Bundesliga, the German league. And when these players go on an off season, a lot of them seem to come back with like an extra 5 kilos of lean muscle over just the off season. And I wonder, is that because they have such a good work capacity? Is it their mentality? Can you speak to any of that from a scientific perspective, why that might be?
I mean, look, I don't work with soccer players. I will say that.
What is
I'd say
athletes,
probably, I mean, possible. But I mean, I'd say it probably has something to do with their macrocyclical periodization. I mean, if we look at a soccer player or a footy player, they're going to spend a bunch of time, like when they're right in the first section of their off season, it's more, GPP, resistance-based training, chuck on size, at least for like, say, rugby, for example, we want to chuck on as much size as we can, big traps so they're stiff as can be through the cervical structures for taking impact, etc. Obviously, you'll consider the position the individual's playing as well. And then it transitions more to strength, more specific with skill and cardiovascular proficiency. And then in the season, it's really just maintaining as much as possible. They probably lose some adaptation at the end of it, especially if they got multi-game weeks and you're trying to balance their recovery burden. So I'd say it probably comes down to primarily that. But I mean, it's possible that uh, the adaptations at the fiber level through the season itself lend themselves well to sort of bouncing back quickly coming into the next section. Plausible.
I learned a little bit
Yeah.
about from Stu Cormack's research and Michael Steffen at the New South Wales Waratahs and Wallaroos. I did a bit of experience with those guys, and what they sort of taught me was that when you're in your off season, there is more of a focus around applying stimulus and overloading and developing those physical adaptations. Whereas in season, it's more about maintaining those adaptations and really focusing on recovery. So they tend
Yeah.
to use a lot more cold water, immersion, cryotherapy in season because they're not too concerned about, I guess, like your protein synthesis and adding lean muscle tissue strength and size. And then
And
in your
this is good
they use
practice.
more hydrotherapy because they're more focused on, right, we don't want to blunt that protein synthesis response. We really want to get as much muscle tissue development and
Yeah.
strength.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, at that level, I have no doubt they're using great practices like that because I think one thing that a lot of individuals don't realize is that recovery and adaptation, although happen in the same time, but are not the same thing. We know that by virtue of training, we're going to accumulate fatigue. In the case of a bodybuilder, fatigue is essentially an inevitable byproduct of training hard enough to facilitate progression. Recovery is like the debt we repay, having trained hard enough to accumulate stimulus. But adaptation and recovery, they are same time point, two separate pieces. Recovery just refers to basically getting back to baseline performance, and adaptation refers to taking the stimulus and doing something with it. And like off season, it's adaptation, adaptation. But when you got multi-game, let's use another sport. Let's say you're doing a Tour de France. Now I've got 7 days of riding. Do I care at all about accumulating adaptation? Absolutely not. I care about getting back to baseline performance as fast as possible to perform at my best tomorrow. And that's where you're going to use like hyper doses of antioxidants to neutralize free radicals, reduce inflammation, hot cold therapy. Yes, it's probably going to come at the expense of the inflammatory response, which may benefit adaptation, but I care nothing for that. So that's good practices in the context of, athlete development for off-season and contest prep. And it's always an interesting piece talking with, say, bodybuilders these days where ice cold therapy is really in vogue now. And I would say, like, if you really enjoy cold therapy, maybe occasionally, but keep it scant. I am definitely a fan of heat therapy. And if you want to get into that, I'm happy to do so. But yeah, it's good practices, man. It really is. Get me on a roll here. So
It all comes back to specificity, doesn't it? Like if everyone's
yeah,
trying to do multiple things at once, you really, I think to be the best at what you're doing, you have to make sacrifices. There's that cost to achieve
yeah.
success.
And I dare say, I mean, there's a lot of thought that goes into bodybuilding and strategy. But I often look at these other sports like that of was AFL, rugby, etc. Their macro cyclical periodization is much more complicated, and to be fair, much more strategic than that of bodybuilding. Bodybuilding, the adaptation we're striving for, hypertrophy is pretty darn forgiving. There's a good way to go about things. There's a better way to go about things, but it is quite forgiving. And we really, obviously, you know, capitalize on that in COVID, for example, when it comes to trying to hold on with piss or equipment. It's more of a nutritional side of things, to be fair, in the bodybuilding side of things, which is more in depth in terms of, well, macrocyclical or probably even close to like quadrennial periodization cycles. Yeah.
So in Modern Wisdom with Chris Williamson, he had Chris Bumstead on, and Chris Bumstead has had a variety of different issues, knee issues, shoulder issues, and he does a lot of cold water immersion, and
Yeah.
what he was saying was that he prefers the injury management, I guess, benefits of the inflammation reduction that comes through cold water immersion, as opposed to that, say, 1 or 2% reduction in hypertrophy that he probably comes about as a result of that. So how much of a trade-off would you say there between someone who's, managing injuries versus someone who wants to maximize their muscle hypertrophy?
Wonderful question. And in terms of, I suppose, if we look at it just generally without injury, the question I asked when this first research came out, 2016-ish, I think it was, maybe it was 17, with cold water immersion and reductions in adaptation. The first question I asked is, well, okay, if it increases our recovery rate, can we push in more volume? And does the increased volume circumvent and maybe allow us to accumulate more net stimulus. And basically everyone went, well, we don't know. Don't know. Obviously, in the case of injury, I would say, yeah, I mean, it's possible that cold water immersion benefits us. It gives us a net benefit in that scenario, because if you're injured and you can't train, there's no stimulus accrual. Or if your training is piss poor, there's not much. So maybe in such a scenario, it could be a benefit. It really comes out of context. I mean, I look at it like we've got all these tools in the tool bag. As coaches, our job is to use the right tool at the right time, or better said, the right combination of tools at the right times, the right magnitudes across nutrition, training, and other recovery modalities. So yeah, in such a scenario, I mean, it may have its place. I will say I love heat therapy. I like heat therapy for two reasons. One is, promoting blood flow to the superficial epithelial tissue could be of benefit in terms of tissue quality. So coming into a show, it's a big maybe. I don't recommend everyone does it, but it's like maybe. The other thing is it tends to correlate with good sleep. I sleep amazing after a sauna. And the other thing is I believe there's potential benefit, similar to cold therapy, in exposing yourself to conditions of which are very uncomfortable. And I've often found that if I've done heat therapy in a dieting scenario there, it's the contrast of extreme discomfort, doing 20 minutes at 40 plus degrees where you're fighting with yourself to stay in there. I found that extreme discomfort may in fact make the dieting condition more bearable. And that's a matter of personal anecdote, not so much research related wisdom.
So just quickly, what would be a sample protocol you follow for sauna around training or using heat therapy?
Actually, so I mean, one other thing I've got to mention there is obviously peripheral blood flow might be of benefit for recovery and maybe of adaptation. But I mean, a conventional piece here is like anything we do participate in, gradual exposure. So I wouldn't say, let's go do 20 minutes in the sauna straight away. But I mean, we might start at say 5 minutes at 40 plus degrees, between 40 and 50, 50 is bloody hot. And then work your way up to 20. I don't think you need to do more than 20.
How many days?
And in terms, I mean, look, this is something that I don't go out of my way to recommend everyone does, but if they have it available and they can do a couple of exposures per week, that's great. I mean, I've met people that do exposure every like 5 days, so with training, so that's a lot. But I mean, I've worked in say 2 or 3 exposures like that, and I mean, I'm jumping in there, a cool shower before I jump in, so that my body temp is, I can last the 20 minutes, jump in there, clock on, get into an almost meditative state of mind where I'm just, keeping myself external to my current situation and running that. And again, there's a mechanism for benefit there, and then there's a bit of personal anecdote there.
I think a mechanism that a lot of people forget about is that regardless of all the scientific backing, blood flow, if you enjoy it and it makes you feel good, that would probably have some pretty good benefit, especially in a contest preparation.
Truthfully, I hate it, but
Yeah.
but it's the after. I'm like,
After,
ooh.
yeah.
Yeah.
The same thing with the cold therapy, like Chris Bump said. If he thinks that it's working for him, then why not do it? You know?
Be psychosomatic, and that's benefit in of itself. I truly believe that. I mean, not specifically related to this, but just broadly speaking, that the success of an athlete starts here, especially in contest preparation. When you're in this sympathetic dominant state, negativity bias is upregulated. You need to constantly stay on your game in reference to your mental approach to training and life in general. And I mean, if this is one of the tools in the tool bag that seems to benefit that, then I would say, great, lean into it potentially.
Yeah, I think bodybuilding is definitely, in my own personal experience, more of a conscious mental battle to push through those feelings of hunger and whereas for running a marathon or those long endurance events, it's almost like a continual physical slog as well, like with the training and that kind of thing that you have to manage on an ongoing basis. Obviously, the duration of exercise is so much greater. As you said, you probably do 5 minutes of working sets per day with bodybuilding. And although there is that fatigue factor that comes with that, I think with long endurance events, you almost have to find this way to like tune out the mind consistently. Which I guess translates a little bit, but for bodybuilding, it's less so about the physical, I find, but more so about the mental grit and tenacity to continue and push away those those feelings of hunger or.
Yeah, definitely. It's an interesting game. And personally, the mental challenge of contest preparation is one of the things I really love about it. It's the sensation of being locked in. And I think every man or woman for that matter needs purpose in their life. And in contest preparation, everything you do has purpose, and every purposeful thing you do has more meaning behind it. And that's one of the things I love about contest prep. You're locked in. It's amazing.
Having to work with these athletes coming into bodybuilding and understanding what we know about the stretch and how important that is, things like integrated partials and 1.5 or quarter reps, how much that can benefit an athlete in a bodybuilding sense, or force reps. What would be your approach to any existing clients or athletes you have now that are getting into bodybuilding, and even those that are transitioning across in terms of that understanding about, I guess, range of motion with repetitions in the gym?
Plus, I suppose I should say that it's not overly common that I have someone who transitions from endurance sports to bodybuilding, but it has happened and it's been an awesome experience. And then second to that, on this talk on the topic of training the length and position, length and partials, I find this super interesting because, again, our industry tends to gravitate to extremes. It takes something and then really runs with it in extreme level, in an extreme manner. Because training in the length and position and the potentially being really productive for hypertrophy is not a new concept. I mean, when I came up, we would bias doing, say, overhead tricep movements versus training in the shortened position. We would bias doing lunges versus doing a hip thrust. So I think it's not a new concept. I do believe that taking it too much in the extreme is counterproductive. I mean, let's just say this, for example, in a rehab-based setting, we often train a tissue in the shortened position because in the shortened position, you have more proprioceptive awareness, you have more tension awareness. So I don't think we should bin all training in the shortened position. I use a combination of, but we might generally bias training the length and position. But I suppose another thing to consider here is training the length and position. You accumulate maybe more stimulus, but also more fatigue. So you need to probably consider training the length versus shortened position within your microcycle design so that you're able to manage fatigue. If I'm training arms 2 days later, maybe I train the shortened position in the first instance, then train the length and where there's a longer recovery period to the next. So I didn't really answer your question here, but in general, it's something that we acknowledge, but I think anything taken to the extreme is counterproductive. And in reference to range, we generally recommend we use the largest range of movement possible, provided that we're working within, primarily at least, the active range of the target tissue. Active range also has its own series of definitions. And we have active range of the target tissue, right joint structures, and joint comfort. And in most scenarios, we have an individual of whom is really short in a given tissue. By challenging that end range through active movement, maybe even through static stretching, we're able to get them to where they need to be to train productively, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a very popular topic at the moment, the length and partials. And I've experimented with them in different ways, doing full sets of length and partials, integrated, like in your squats, 1.5 reps, extending a set by repping it out in the lengthened position. What do you think of those different techniques, and do you use them in programming at all? And if so, how do you kind of track the stimulus and the fatigue? Because it gets quite hard to track volume when you start doing things like that.
It gets hazy. So to start with integrated length and partials, again, not a new thing. Charles Poliquin was doing integrated partials way back when, with Olympic lifters, with bodybuilders. So now all this coming out 1.25 reps. I'm like, man, like we were doing this a decade ago, but it's in vogue now. And I do like to do 1.25 reps. In part, we spend a bit more time in lengthened position. If there's a benefit there, that's great. But let's say, for example, in doing a 1.25 squat, part of the benefit is that when you're in the bottom portion of the squat, glutes are in a great position for power development. The adductor magnus, with its sort of more posterior insertion on the linea aspera, is also in a great position for not just co-contracting gates of glute med and min, but providing hip extension. So I want to spend time in there for maybe a length and partial benefit, and then maybe capitalizing a bit more adductor and glute. So I look at it like, if there's a benefit, great, but there's also another reason for it. And if we're looking at sort of just like length and partial only training, I look at that and I again, depends how extreme. Let's say, for example, you're doing a bench press. I have no problem with stopping just before lockout because once the wrist, elbow, and shoulder are stacked, there's not much tension. That's fine. You're probably going to be able to stay tighter through the scapulothoracic junction, just pausing before lockout. But if we're looking at taking it to the real extreme, it's like, I'm going to do the first 5 degrees only of this leg extension and just rep there. I'm like, okay, we're probably missing out on some potential benefit because it's not like there's no tension through the other, 45 plus degrees of range. And then lastly, if we're looking at sort of lengthened partials as almost like a mechanical drop set, if you will, I would look at that and go, yeah, like we could do that on occasion, say a row and then finish the set and do some just scapular retraction. I trialed this and I'd say it could be of benefit. It is hard to track volume, but it's a variable that I might say on occasion, let's trial this. We're doing this T-bar row. Let's try to, can you get an extra 2 repetitions out by the time you do get to the end of your set? Everything should be, the tissue of which you're targeting should be the rate limiting factor anyway. So you're probably going to get 2 extra reps out with a partial there. But it's a variable we can play with, but it's not something that I emphasize on all the time. It's just,
I think it becomes very murky, doesn't it? Because you almost get to this point where you've failed and you're doing partials. What portion of that movement is indicative of one partial rep? You might do a partial rep that's kind of halfway through the full range of motion, and then you fatigue more, you can only do a quarter of that range of motion. So like, I guess quantifying the.
Can also say one other thing is that if you have someone who's not very advanced, who doesn't know where true failure is, and you tell them we're going to do lengthened partials, they will stop many reps before actual failure with a full range and do some lengthened partial garbage. So it's one of those things where that could be, let's say, for example, I like doing my rep clusters on occasion. I do not give that to a beginner athlete. They don't know how to train hard. So if you can't do a hard straight set, you shouldn't be doing an intensity technique like that. And I think the same with lengthened partials at the back end of the set, because if you give this to an amateur, they're going to cut themselves short every time. So the foundation is always there. Things like this, it's the sprinkle on top, and that's really what I think it should be.
How do you distance a lot of young people coming through, seeing you that maybe have got swept up in the TikTok craze with Sam Sulek? And I know he's got a great physique, trains very hard, and we're in no way discounting what he's doing. I think it's great. If anything, it makes people more passionate about bodybuilding, but he's very much, less about, I'd say, perfect technique execution, but a lot about those like partial reps. So, and a lot of the kids I imagine coming through are teenagers wanting to get into bodybuilding that may be coming for you for coaching, potentially swept up in that.
I suppose a couple of things. I mean, I'm not really big on following Sam stuff, but I mean, it's hard not to see it. And I think in general, he's doing a lot of good for bodybuilding. And I suppose it's also important to acknowledge that like his mission is just putting out what he does. And he's definitely, I don't believe even himself in the way he markets himself, so to speak, that he's an expert per se. Yeah, I mean, he definitely has great work ethic, and I think we can learn from everyone, right? Here's where I look at it like this. We should always choose to listen to everyone, take in their perspective, and then within doing so, never lose the ability to think critically. I look at Sam Sulek, I'm like, man, guy knows how to train hard. That's fantastic. I don't think there's many others out there as passionate as this guy. That's fantastic, right? Do I want to train how he trains? I have small joint structures. I can tell you I'll do 6 weeks of that and I'll feel like my elbows are going to explode. So I'm like, no, let's think this is not an appropriate way for me to train. Okay. We might look at Dr. Mike's training. There is a lot of great things Dr. Mike does. It's a few things that maybe I'm a bit on the fence about, right? Where I might lean towards more some of the thought process that Sam might have. For example, just looking at 2 people on the opposite end of the spectrum. So I try to look at things through an unbiased scientific lens. I have my biases. I am human, but I always try and listen, take in everything, think critically, take the components that I think are of benefit. And it's something that I try to put forth to our athletes, because personally as a coach, I am first a pragmatist, second a scientist. that's how I would sort of label myself, right? So I wanted to take all that detail together and, and package it up for athletes and encourage them to think critically on the way as well.
On the topic of Mike Israetel, there's been some recent research that's come out that's looking at how doing up to even 50 sets of volume over the course of a program can actually really be beneficial for muscle hypertrophy or maximize muscle hypertrophy. But essentially what they did was they had 3 groups. The first group was a low volume group. They did 22 sets of quad training per week, and this was split evenly among 2 workouts. Group 2 was like medium volume. So they had about 22 sets of quad training. They were adding 4 sets each week, every 2 weeks, sorry. And this resulted in 42 sets per week. Now the high volume group, they were adding 6 sets of volume weekly, every 2 weeks. And this was 52 sets per week by the end of the program. So I guess the thing to consider there is that progressive accrual of more volume. But that is, for someone reading that as a natural, it's a lot of volume. What's your take on the ideal training volume? And do you have any criticisms about that study, I guess?
Look, I will admit I read that study a little while back. So, and was one of the things that one of Daniel and I's meetings, because we were just frothing over this at the time. But I'm not able to critique it off the top of the dome. I do remember that 52 sets was at the end of the study. The average volume of sets was considerably lower than that. And there was quite some interpersonal variability. And if we sort of go back to what I was saying before, the paper of which the author alludes my mind in reference to some of the differences in interpersonal response to a given amount of volume, the hyper responders, lesser hyper and lower responders, and the volume of subjective fatigue they accumulated, it kind of makes sense that you're going to have a lot of interpersonal variability there. So there's definitely, and look, in terms of limitations, there are a bunch, but again, I can't remember the exact methodological design there. But I mean, if you're doing 52, I will say this, doing 52 sets for say 2 weeks versus doing 52 sets for 6 weeks is very, very, very different. We have rest days, we wash off most of the accumulated fatigue, but fatigue builds in the background for a good chunk of time. Even with said fatigue in the background, we're producing quality volume. There comes a point where fatigue overcomes and volume quality turns to garbage. And I dare say with 52 sets, with most individuals, if they're training hard, you're probably going to have, a downside in the sort of interim future. So I love this sort of research. It sort of pushes the boundaries, and it's there to tease out some more knowledge, but nothing ever comes out that's super concrete. And I think from a practical perspective, we still need to personalize volume requirements. Most individuals will fit within a general bell curve, and then obviously you'll branch off and personalize from there. And I do have some of my Korean boys, some of them have very high training volumes, and I've got a couple of other guys which are on minuscule amounts of volume comparatively. So there is a lot of variability there. And keep in mind also there's environmental factors which determine your volume requirements and tolerance as well.
I'm just trying to imagine pushing myself on a set of leg press when I know I have 49 sets left in the week of quads. It's like,
reps reserve failure, 52 sets. Like,
yeah, it's brutal, man.
A bit ridiculous, in my personal opinion. But again, differences between individuals and the way I look at my own programming is a lot of the literature looking at maximal recoverable volume of 20 sets per muscle group per week. So I'll do, a leg session with a lot of quads, a sprinkling of hamstrings, maybe add some hamstring sets to my back workout, say through the form of like a deadlift, and sort of like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. But I guess what's your approach there with, program design, and what would be your recommendations for natural athletes? I know you're saying that it's very individualized between athletes.
But I mean, in general, I would define myself as being principle-based. I think we should all be principle-based. If we understand the fundamental principles, our programming capacity becomes borderline infinite. And I'm being very dramatic in saying that. But if we take those fundamental principles, we can allocate training in accordance with the athlete's needs. So, I will start at the level of microcycle and we'll go, okay, how many days a week can the individual train? What area do we need to emphasize on? And that area, if we have an area that we need to emphasize on by way of, there's a developmental deficit, yes, I'm going to look at movement quality because usually success or failures leave clues, but we may choose to put in place a specialization where we are accruing more volume towards a given tissue and decreasing elsewhere to sort of free up more of our systemic recovery for a given tissue. And then that centerpiece, that forms the centerpiece for the program in terms of how we allocate our volume through the week. If I want a 3 time per week quad frequency, then my upper body volume distribution in terms of total through the microcycle and distribution through the week needs to be quite different. And I would usually go, okay, let's look at what your previous volumes are. If we have an idea and we assume and we understand that training quality is very high by way of intensity, we can use that as a reference point. If we don't, I usually start in the middle of current evidence-based recommendations. We apply it, we assess the outcome, we adjust. And that would be the sort of general structure.
Yeah. I really like to see those numbers as really a starting point because it is so variable. And it can be even variable for the one person, depending on how their recovery is that week. Maybe they push just a little bit harder one week. The amount of sets they can actually recover from it would be so variable. So yeah, a starting point and just working through those principles, I think,
Another
is the way to
point
go.
is there may actually be intra-personal differences on a tissue-to-tissue basis. I'll give you an example. I worked with an Asian gentleman a little while back, and his structural anthropometry in reference to his sort of the shape of his rib cage in relation to, the insertion of the pec on the anterior lip of the bicipital groove was so favorable. He would look at a dumbbell press, look at the bench press, and have a big raging chest pump. So in his scenario, I put more than 6 sets of chest per week. We went up to say 12. He's like, oh, I strained a pec. What? Okay, so we set his volume at 6, but then for back, for example, he really struggled to connect with his back. So that was a matter of really emphasizing movement quality and then over time sequentially increasing his back volume. His back volume was triple, I think over triple at one point, his push-based volume. So you even have that kind of variability intra-person. So yeah.
We'd like to switch lanes a little bit now, Brandon, if that's all right, because although the audience might not know that you have a master's in nutrition science. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's great.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that first before we jump into the nutrition side of things?
Yeah,
when
yeah,
you got
sure.
it, why you went to that as well.
Well, I actually only recently got that. So, I mean, like you guys, I studied exercise science, and then after that, I really focused on nutrition, did a post-grad dip, etc. Loved it. Obviously, a very important part of what we do in coaching bodybuilding. When COVID hit, I was actually planning on getting back on stage, and I thought, you know what? This is a great time. Let's look at the positives here because I'm a hopeless optimist to get into this master's in science, majoring in sports nutrition. Had a really great program, which allowed me to do some research in a field of which I am interested in, which is, of course, bodybuilding. So, yeah, I did that across over a series of years, and I wrapped that one up last year. Master's in science, majoring in nutrition, sports nutrition with distinction, which is very nice. And more than anything for me, that was just a means of getting my feet wet in research. I first and foremost am a pragmatist. So I didn't want to pursue research, but I wanted to experience it. And if there's any positive crossover to practice, then I wanted to make sure I was absorbing that to ensure I can give the best result to our athletes. That was essentially my rationale.
Yeah, so it's very credible to have people like yourself on here with evidence-based side of things, understanding your study that you've done. It validates a lot more of those personal achievements you've got in the bodybuilding realm. We know bodybuilding, whilst it is very much based around training intensity, like we've spoken about, there's also the huge influence of nutrition.
Yeah.
And now, what I was saying to Aidan when we were preparing for this episode during the week was, online, there's very much this messaging around calories in, calories out. It's as simple as that, increase your energy expenditure, reduce your intake, and you're going to lose weight. But now, one thing coming from an exercise physiology background, I see a lot of individuals with chronic disease. I work a lot with people with diabetes, for instance, and oftentimes they have other form of comorbidities. So I think 33% of people with type 2 diabetes have some form of cardiovascular complication. They may be on beta blockers, different forms of medication which inhibit their appetite. And with diabetes comes a lot of anxiety, depression as well. And with these particular conditions, SSRIs, for example, mess around a little bit with metabolism and hunger and appetite. In my personal opinion, we make things too simplified. And for the broader public, I think that it can create a bit of disharmony in terms of people's motivation to continue when they don't see results, but potentially they're not seeing those results because of all these other factors biologically and pathologically. So, I guess how do you navigate that conversation with athletes, calories in, calories out, and how do you account for different potential conditions an individual might have?
Well, look, as a start, I will say that, calories in, calories out, Kiko, in a lot of ways, I mean, it's a factual reality in terms of increasing or decreasing body mass. That's irrefutable, but it is an oversimplification. And I think this is in part a product of, social media, an attention span of a goldfish. People like to simplify. And I believe that the translation of complex concepts and sort of just translating that to the masses is overall a good thing to a point. I mean, it's not as simple as, hey, let's go calories in, calories out. Don't worry about doing the 60-degree call a day. I mean, yes, calories in, calories out is going to influence changes in body mass, but I mean, your macronutrients and micronutrients and your training stimulus is going to determine where that increase or decrease in body mass comes from and the overall health status of the individual, which indirectly over time influences your body composition. So it is an oversimplification. When it comes to working with sort of clinical populations like you do, I do specialize in sports nutrition. So it's primarily with healthy individuals. Obviously with dietetics, you have the opportunity to work more in a hospital-based setting. That just wasn't for me. And things with, SSRIs, I mean, they are likely to influence appetite. As to whether they influence changes in metabolic rate, I'm not entirely sure, and that is unfortunately outside of my wheelhouse in terms of expertise, and I'll be honest and transparent in saying that. So said simply, it is an oversimplification, and realistically, if there's something that's outside of my scope, I will refer on.
I was thinking less so diving into the SSRIs more specifically. I think it was just an example of how there are different considerations, whether it be pharmacological or, pathological for the individual, whether they have like thyroid issues, for instance, even sleep. If someone doesn't get enough sleep, how their hormones are out of whack and how much that can influence. There's research showing how much hungry they are during the day and how that can kind of offset their adherence to a diet during prep.
Nutrition gets inherently complicated given that we are dealing with a complex series of systems is the human body and the manner of which it responds/reacts to its environment. If we were robotic in nature, it would be much more simplistic. And I think that's one of the roles of us coaches is to shape our athletes in a manner of shape our athletes / shape our protocol in a manner of which allows for ease of application, for lack of a better term. So yeah, coaching needs to be hands-on on that side of things for sure.
Hayden and I are both in prep at the moment, and this is my first prep. Hayden's done it a few times, and there's a few things that we want to touch on when it comes to nutrition and prep. First being, you and I had a conversation a few weeks ago around fat intake, because I came to you and I said, I've experienced in the past, for some reason, when my fats get low but not really low, I really start to notice like mental effects of that. And it's unusual because I have clients and you have clients who can function quite well on, 0.6, 0.5 grams per kilogram of fat. Whereas me, I seem to go below like 0.8 and I just don't feel great. So how much interpersonality is there in your experience when it comes to prep around macronutrients?
Well, significant. I mean, in part, so let's say this goes across all macronutrients. We're going to personalize that, and when we personalize it, we base it on mechanistic understanding. We'll also look at performance indicators. We'll look at some of the subjective indicators in terms of general biofeedback. So in the case of, say, protein, we might personalize that if we're looking to, within the limits of what can be achieved, manage satiety, or, for example, free up more of our energy intake for carbohydrate, for performance within the constraints of our energy budget. Fats, we do similar. We shuffle around. We want to ensure we have enough fats for ADK absorption, sex hormone production, and of course, recovery, given that cell membranes are phospholipid in nature. But there is instances, yeah, where individuals start to experience, for example, in your scenario, some changes in their subjective perception of well-being, and that may be influenced by fats. A bit hard to know. I mean, there's a psychosomatic expectation bias might come into play there. It's a bit hard to know. But I mean, this is where you personalize on a one-on-one basis, and that's essentially what we did in your scenario. But in general, I would say, again, I'm speaking broadly here, but there is significant interpersonal variability. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I said to Aidan was kind of like, if we strip things right back to that kind of universal perception of, calories in, calories out, fats per gram, 9 calories, carbs, protein, 4 calories. So early in a deficit, I guess one of the strategies that, I've used in the past or have used is to reduce fats early on so that you can hold a larger volume of food to maintain I guess, fullness, fibrous carbohydrate in your diet to maintain satiety. Is this something that you use with your clients? So again, is it a very case by case basis?
It is definitely case by case, but I would say this: I will, if fats are very high, I may reduce them at the start of a contest preparation, right? If fats are very high. But generally speaking, even in an off season, I'm going to employ a moderate fat intake, high carbohydrate diet in order to best fuel the glycolytic energy pathways associated with training performance. In an off season, the goal is to really emphasize on training quality, so training performance, and then leveraging adaptation from that, fueling that accordingly. So generally speaking, it's going to be a typical performance-orientated nutrition system. So in which case, if I've worked with them in the off season, fats are already moderated, I'm probably not going to reduce fats much to start, maybe a little bit. And then it's more towards the back end of a contest preparation where I'll usually dig fats a little bit more assertively for short periods. And this is say usually because again, it's person dependent, but if I'm going to pull fats down, say 0.5 grams per kilo, I don't want to do this for 30 weeks. We're going to do this for a short amount of time. But usually in such a scenario, it's really about trying to, as it always is, essentially perform as optimally as possible in the suboptimal environment that is the dieting condition. So I'm going to sacrifice a bit of fats to keep carbohydrate up within the constraints of energy budget to ensure that we are holding on to as much performance as possible.
One thing I like about the approach you take, Brandon, with nutrition is the fact that you're not throwing all your strategies at the individual straight away. I would like you to explain a little bit more about that because, as I said, it is a strategy that I think is quite helpful.
Look, in general, I look at it like in contest preparation or as professionals, we only have so many tools we can use. And we want to use these tools at the right times. So in the context of a contest preparation, yeah, I don't want to throw everything at the individual from the get-go because what works now, but not forever. Then what? So even, for example, food volume will generally keep food selection similar from the off season, adjust the quantities to accommodate for our new targets. Height will increase definitely down the track. As it does, we start to substitute those conventional food selections for more volume-based food selections. Then we increase the food volume again, and then we maximize it later on down the track when we're in the pits of the contest preparation before we come up for the show. And the same goes with fats. Yeah, we want to leave some tools in the tank for later. So I kind of describe it like the science and art of coaching is really knowing what variables you can change and what influence it should have on the series of biological systems. The art is knowing how to interpret what you're seeing in real time and to adjust the right variables at the right times at the appropriate magnitudes. That's sort of in a nutshell.
So in terms of talking about the prep itself and the food that the athlete actually consumes, one of the things that I've heard you talk about in previous podcasts is working with Gen Pop versus working with an athlete and some of the differences that come with that. Aiden and I, we were talking a bit about, I guess, the enjoyment side of food during prep and how much sustainable weight loss for someone, Gen Pop, someone who's looking to achieve sustainable weight loss long term. In my personal opinion, yes, the enjoyment of the foods you're eating on a daily basis is really important to the innate success of your diet and achieving success with that over a longer period of time. But when it comes to a bodybuilding prep, that, in my opinion, it's not sustainable weight loss. You've got a specific goal in mind to get as lean as you can. Oftentimes it's not fun. It's not enjoyable. Yes, there may be times where we try to, for instance, myself, add more herbs and spices or a bit of salt, sriracha sauce. Maybe you have a Coke Zero or a sugar-free beverage to try and get rid of those cravings. But what would be your advice to anyone out there that's training really hard with their bodybuilding and wants to do a prep, but kind of has that association with enjoying their food and actually leaning down and dieting?
Well, I suppose I have a couple of pieces here. I would say that in general, if you are a bodybuilding enthusiast and you have a passion for fine dining 4 times per week, I would say you, my friend, are in for a pretty darn hard, honest preparation at the start. But above and beyond that, I would say it's important to acknowledge that in the dieting condition, there is a variety of adaptations of which occur in reference to food behavior. There is an increase in food reward sensitivity. Things that taste good taste freaking fantastic. You also have delayed satiation and a decrease in food volume perception. It's part of the reason why after a show, you have a donut and it's like, wow, this is better than sex. And when you eat, you have no sensation of fullness until 30 minutes later, it's like, now I'm going to die. So this is obviously very intelligent adaptation, for it's intended to basically assertively cue you to restore your depleted energy stores. So I think in contest preparation, again, this is a matter of strategy. It's good to enjoy your food, but in contest preparation, individuals often find themselves adding a lot more flavor to their meals. It's not the time to do that, because in reference to appetite, we have sort of homeostatic drivers for appetite, your true physiological needs, and we have non-homeostatic drivers for appetite, which is basically enjoyment. You don't eat chocolate because it's nutritious. You eat it, it tastes good, it's hyper palatable, triggers reward centers in the brain that can override your satiety biofeedback signals, which are already out of sorts in contest prep. So it can make you essentially hungrier. So I like to adjust the hedonic, i.e. the enjoyment of food, palatability, if you will, depending on the phase. So if we're in the off season, appetite's very low, strategically overfueling. Maybe I want to make the food selections more palatable. Maybe there's a little less volume. That also makes it easy for you, but I want to make it uber enjoyable to try and get you to consume enough food. In opposition to that, in contest preparation, there is rationale to assume that maybe keeping foods a little bit more on the plainer side may aid with appetite management. And I mean, you guys can attest to this. Just eating a little bit of rice. You've had plain rice in contest preparation. You're like, oh, it's amazing. Everyone around you's looking, you're like, what are you talking about, man? You're like, I'm telling you, you should try this rice. This is different than it was 6 months ago. So you're probably gonna get a whole lot of enjoyment out of the plain stuff anyway. But I would generally encourage our athletes not to get too experimental. Oftentimes it's 6 weeks out from a show and they're like, wow, I'm very food focused. I want to start making all of these creative dishes with a lot of diet related products, of which hide a lot of their calories behind low intensity artificial sweeteners like sugar alcohols. You're going to run into some problems. So strategically modulating the hedonic power of the food can be a benefit as well.
Yeah. I tell you what, isn't it funny how amazing it is when you have, it ought to be like a bowl of basmati rice with some steamed vegetables with a little tiny bit of salt and pepper, and you have that during a prep, and it's like the carrots are so much sweeter than they are in an off season. When it's off season, I don't even think too much about the vegetables. It's all about just smashing plenty of pasta and rice and mince and chicken. It's amazing how it changes.
The most hilarious thing I always see is an athlete coming to me like, B, I'm telling you, man, this dish, like, oh, what is it? It's like, oh, oats with zucchini ground into it. Like, man, it's so good. I'm going to eat this in the off season. Oh, I know you won't, mate. You'll be in the off season having Cocoa Pops. Like, I'm telling you. But in their head, they're like, this is that amazing. I'm telling you.
I've already noticed the almonds that you have in my meal plan are getting sweeter. I've never enjoyed almonds really, but already I look forward to having my almonds with my rice.
It's the little things, man. See?
Wait till you lose. Wait till you lose the whey and the protein oats. I say
And it's
like even blueberries, fresh blueberries with some like 30 grams of like 20 grams of almonds and 30 grams of blueberries with some oats and whey protein is like heaven.
it's on. Yeah.
No, it was really a light bulb moment for me, Brandon, when I came to you and I said, starter prep, do you have any ideas for making some like good, like, or, creative meals in prep? And you told me how it's probably not the best idea getting into the habit of seeking kind of enjoyment or that hedonic enjoyment out of food when we go into
Yeah.
this process. And I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
There's a time and a place. Our relationship with food is inherently complicated. It goes well beyond fueling. I mean, there's a cultural significance there. Christmas is a great example. It brings people together. It's the glue like that. There's a time for enjoying food. And I mean, you should derive some level of enjoyment in certain times in the context of, a sustainable off season. But Connor's prep, I mean, it's not a sustainable phase. It's intended to be sustainable only for the duration of the actual prep itself. We kind of get in terms of the body composition, and then we get out. And that's basically, we are eating for function throughout that time. That's how it goes.
We'd like to pose a little thought experiment to you
Uh,
on the topic of on the topic of enjoying food.
okay.
Fuck, this is the wrong time to be talking about food, isn't it?
These two guys in Connor's prep
Hungry.
here.
He's going to go out of here and break his diet straight out.
Well, if you could only have one meal for the rest of your life and you're still a bodybuilder, so you had one source of carbs, fats, protein, what would that plate look like?
Uh, it probably, oh my gosh, mate, how many ingredients can I have for this plate? I would say we probably have salmon, rice, and avocado. I would be severely micronutrient deficient, but I would be at least covering my protein. Actually, I'd probably go salmon. Let's go a form of fruit and avocado. At least I'm getting in some omega-3s, some other unsaturated fats, carbohydrate, hopefully a dose of micronutrients within whatever fruit I choose. And that's where I'd go. I know I didn't really give you. Are you expecting like spaghetti bolognese, man? That's what we're going for. I'm getting
So I guess
function.
one source of protein. So your protein would be salmon. Your fats would come from avocado. And what would you say? What's
Fruit.
your
Oh, you said fruit.
Yeah.
Man, let's go. I'd go for dragon fruit just because it is my favorite.
Yeah, okay. So not the standard chicken, rice, and broccoli.
Well, I'm looking at it going, I need some omega-3 fats. That's
Yeah.
incredibly important. I'm not going to get that from my chicken. There's more micronutrient dense carbohydrate sources than rice. So I'll go for a fruit. I'm still going to be micronutrient deficient, but I'll get in the ballpark. Here I am talking about function. How's that?
The other one we're going to do now is exercise wise.
We stole this off Chris Williamson as well. Or Modern Wisdom.
Alrighty.
Yeah, so let's play a bit of Jenga here. This is like what I do with my periodization, really, my exercise programming. It's like you get 20 sets per muscle group. All right, now how are we going to periodize this so I'm adequately recovered and got enough stimulus throughout the week? So if you had 10 exercises and you could only do those 10 exercises for the rest of your life, what exercises would you pick to develop a well-proportioned exercise program that targets each of your different muscle groups? And that could be in relation to you personally, whether there's some muscles that you find respond well to certain exercises, and what would you recommend? Yeah. What would you pick?
I'll give a framework for movement patterns and then we'll fill it in with movements. I'd go 2 push, 2 pull, a squat, hinge, and then I would fill the gaps in my isolation. It's 10 movements. Man, I can do a whole program with this. Let's go. I do a horizontal push. Let's go Smith machine bench press. A vertical push, Smith machine, shoulder press. I do like Smith machine. We'll go vertical pull, horizontal pull. So we'll go lat pull down, cable row. I can make a cable row more mid back, more lat bias. We've got versatility. We'd go a squat based variation, probably a V squat. And from there, we would go a hinge. I'd probably go an RDL if I had to do nothing but. And from there, we'd fill the gaps. Go an overhead tricep extension, a forward facing cable curl, load the stretch position for biceps. And I think I got 2 movements left. Is that right?
Yeah.
Let's go. Well, I would probably do a knee flexion movement, hamstring curl, and a leg extension. And unfortunately, my calves getting no stimulus, but I only got 10 movements.
No calves or lateral raises in there.
There is not. You're right. Jeez.
This
But
is
movements.
it's a bit like the research you're talking about with Mike Mensa, with Mike Israetel, but there's probably a few exceptions to this. Hey, you don't really need equipment. You could do some calf raises, bodyweight calf raises, high volume. If there's the tricep push down, we could even change whether it's a rope or straight bar. So I guess
I think it's cheating now. Though.
we need to make this a bit stricter. This thought experiment.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, 10 movements, that would probably get us most of what we need. And I think realistically, I mean, all things done right, I think a full program is probably going to be 15 exercises, not much more than that. If you're looking at sort of a bodybuilding specific program, probably less than that if you're looking at powerlifting. Not that I am a powerlifter.
We're going to roll into some questions now, Brandon. I know we've come up to around two hours now, and we really appreciate your time. We now want to share some of well, we haven't got any listeners yet because we haven't released this episode, but we've got a little bit of audience that's already growing around our Instagram page, and we reached out to them to get some questions for this episode. And we're just going to go through those now. So the first one we got from another natural pro and friend of mine, Evan Goodby. You may be familiar with.
I know Evan. Yes, of course.
Now, Evan's probably going to be on the podcast at some point in time, but he has asked you if you had to swap physiques with any current natural professional bodybuilder, who would it be?
Do you have to say current? Because if it wasn't current, I'd probably go with Martin Ortiz, a bodybuilder that probably not many people are going to know because I think he's just etching in on the first section of the social media realm. I used to love Martin's physique, WMBF pro with this incredible density, but I am going against the question because that's not current. Otherwise, it'd be Brian Whitaker, but that's not current either. I love these older school dudes. Well, let's just say
Mike O'Hearn.
I definitely. You're throwing me out here.
We don't want to get started on fake natties. That will be a slippery slope to losing the integrity of this podcast.
Look, if I was to rephrase that and just say natural bodybuilder in general, it'd be Martin Ortiz. It just has a physique that is just incredibly dense, and I just love that aesthetic.
We'll take that. Next one. The next one is, we know the prep and the off season are hard in different ways. What are the things you struggle the most with during a contest prep and the off season?
So we'll start in the off season because in order to be a bodybuilder, we have to build the body. In the off season, probably the biggest thing we struggle with is the fact that, particularly as an advanced athlete when progress is slow, is the fact that progress is almost subliminal in nature and it requires a lot of delayed gratification. And because there's not many quantitative metrics for us to evaluate, you require clarity in your vision, essentially, in what you're doing. So that's probably the most challenging piece there, is keeping that vision alive in mind so you can rationalize the investment in the gym. In contest preparation, there's 3 things that challenge an individual, 3 primary things. It's going to be brain fog, appetite, low energy, in which case and everything else that branches out from that. In which case, for me, it's probably brain fog is the most challenging piece. I find myself needing to sectionalize my work in smaller doses so I can maintain productivity for, say, 40 minutes, recover 40 minutes, as opposed to just going 3-hour blocks at a time. So I'd say that.
Hi, team. I have a question for the upcoming podcast with Brandon, if you have time. What recommendations do you have to increase free testosterone naturally for a natural female figure competitor over 50?
Interesting one.
Yeah, so a little bit left of center, but
yeah, look, generally speaking, if we want to promote endogenous production of testosterone, we're going to need appropriate energy availability, sufficient volume of fats. Outside of that, we'll make sure we're taking care of our micronutrient needs so that we've got the substance we need to enhance, or better said, optimize endogenous production. I mean, that's broadly speaking. Broadly speaking, from a natural perspective, this would be the go-to piece. If we're looking at specialized supplements, most supplements are really, if we're looking at, say, zinc, for example, we'll say, oh, zinc's going to enhance testosterone. I would say if you have a deficiency, yes, but if you are sufficient, additional zinc is going to be of no further benefit. But those would be the fundamentals we would cover. And if the individual has clinically low testosterone, then we're probably going to look at outsourcing to a endocrinologist and go from there.
I guess this question, before we wrap things up, really lends itself to this ongoing myth about females getting really muscly from weightlifting. Maybe we just unpack this a little bit, because as a female figure competitor, the hormone, I guess, sex hormone difference between males and females, we're going to have a lot more testosterone and less estrogen. They're going to have a lot less testosterone, a lot more estrogen. So I guess debunk that myth of, for us, the idea that females are going to get bulky and muscly by lifting weights. And also, I guess, how much of a consideration is this for, say, like your bikini competitors and those female athletes that might be listening in a natural setting? Is this something that they would really need to think too much about?
You should be scared. No, I would say the following. If we're looking at, say, figure, there are not many women who have the genetic proclivities and the heart to train for 5+ years progressively to achieve that level of muscularity. So at least for high-end drug-free figure. Hence, I don't believe it's a concern for most individuals that they're going to become excessively bulky. When you are looking at bikini category, depending on whether it's IFBB bikini, ICM bikini, very different. Surprisingly, not to get off topic, a lot of bikini athletes in the IFBB are enhanced, which is rather disturbing and in my mind quite unnecessary, but that's a discussion for another day. But in such a category where you're bottlenecked for how much muscularity, furthermore, particularly in IFBB bikini, there is, which is arguably one of the most genetically predetermined categories in the IFBB circuit. It's incredible. You need to be very strategic with where you allocate that muscle. It's one of the reasons I actually find quite a lot I find it quite interesting, IFBB bikini, because there's a huge amount of strategy in the manner of which you allocate volume to grow in only the right areas. But in general, broadly speaking, I don't believe any woman is going to wake up after a day of weight training and go, geez, I got too jacked. Let me just slow down. Let's just quit the squats right now. I don't need that.
What I always say is, like, if I do get someone who's a bit worried about, because it's usually Gen Pop, people who are new to the gym that are worried about that. I say, look, I've been trying to do it for years and it's still not happened yet. So I don't think you have to worry about getting too bulky.
And they would say, oh, I just think you're too big. I think you are too bulky. And you're like, oh, thank you. Cheers.
All right. With that, mate, thanks so much for your time. And it was an absolute pleasure to, I guess, meet you for the first time today and have a chat about all things bodybuilding and weight training. Pleasure to have you. And we look forward to our next episode down the track, no doubt.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Brandon.